Okay, so today you got two handouts. You got the first one is assignment 102, which you do not yet have the skills to do. So yes, I'm giving it to you today, but I'm not expecting you to work on it over the long weekend. Enjoy your time off, and then when you come back next week is when we'll really sit down and you'll get the skills put together to be able to do this. It is due at the start of class on Wednesday the 24th, so 2 weeks away. Not quite 2 weeks away. No, today's Wednesday. Yeah, 2 weeks away. 2 weeks from today, you will do very similar to what you did in this assignment, where you'll post your final version online, and then you'll give me a paper print just off of the school printer here, so that I have a record of what you did. Next Wednesday, when you get back, I'll sit down and we'll go through a bunch of examples of previous student work. I'll talk about what was effective about it, what worked well, how they did various files, and then we'll move forward from there. And it'll make a lot more sense. But I at least like to give it to you so you can be kind of thinking in the back of your mind. The other thing that you can do is you can look at prior student work on the course website, and you can see what people have done before to get ideas. There's nothing wrong with borrowing ideas of what other people have done. The picture that's on the handout of the T-shirt that's hanging on the wall with the body in it, but the half removed or whatever, is a very good example. I've seen variants of that theme before, and they tend to turn out pretty well. So we'll talk about those. She was not unique in coming up with that. There are other ones prior to her, but it's a pretty good execution of it. We also have a handout today for exercise 106, which I will go into in far greater detail as we go along. Today. It looks like most of you have turned in your assignment 101s today. I hope that you all have them posted. That's the most critical part. And then as you finish up with the individual handouts or the individual prints, you're welcome to bring them up here so that I have a physical record. Okay, so today we're going to talk about two very specialized types of images. One is called a high dynamic range image, or an HDR image, and the other is called a panoramic image, or panoramic photography. The high dynamic range images have a variety of uses, some of which are artistic and some of which are functional, and I'll talk about what those are as we go forward. So we'll start in the world of high dynamic range photography, or HDR photography. I will use HDR in place of high dynamic range because it's a long word. So the bottom line is, what is high dynamic range? So if we were to go out on a golf course and we were to shoot a picture, if we weren't shooting at high dynamic range, we'd see this image as a result. We'd have a reasonably exposed, maybe the grass would be exposed, but the sky would be completely white. Maybe the shadows would be exposed, in which case the sky would be even whiter than it is right now. And instead, if we shot in what's called high dynamic range, we'd get an image that looks more like this. We have nice color in the grass, we can see a little bit of detail in the shadows, and we can also see the sunset. So we're getting a greater set, or a greater set of values in the scene, or we're getting more dynamic range between the luminances of the light and dark areas. Okay? So this results in images that are like this. And you guys have seen images like this online before. The gorgeous sunset, that kind of thing. Those tend to be high dynamic range. So how does this really work? So we talked a little bit about it in the photography section, but I'm going to walk through it a little bit better here, in that when we go and shoot the photos, right, we shoot 3, 5, or maybe 7 photos. Right? Some really good photographers might do more than that. And that collection of images tends to be called a bracketed set of images. So it's images that are designed to go together. It's the same frame, right? And so in this instance, I have 3 images. It's always hard to show on slides how you have the 3 images, but you get the idea. The center one here is the one that the camera thought was, quote, correctly exposed, right? So it should have an exposure value of 0.00. So if we look at this, we have a reasonable exposure of the water. It's pretty good. The sky's a little bit washed out, right? We get some pretty decent reflections here in the tide pools and stuff. It's decent. Then we have one with an exposure value set higher, maybe 1.75, 1.74, something like that, positive. And this, if we were to look at it, we get pretty good exposure in the ocean, right? We can see a lot of the blues in the ocean, but we lose almost the entire sunset, and we lose quite a lot of the reflections down here at the bottom. Okay? The third of this bracketed set of 3 images would be this upper one, where we get a really great sky, right? But we get very, very dark water, very dark reflections here, right? So one of these images by itself is not really that good, right? If I were to give you this image and say, isn't this a great image? You'd go, I don't know, okay? This one in the middle is probably as close to good as I could get for right now, but it's still nowhere near a compilation of the 3 images. So if we take these 3 individuals and we put them together, we might get an image that looks like this. Okay? So if we flip back and forth a little bit to see these, okay, we're getting the blues from this and this, right, in the final image, but we're getting the sky from this image and the reflection down here from that image. All right, so we go forward again, okay? We get the really nice sky, we get the nice rich blue water, and we also get the reflections off the sand down here. So we're getting a combination of those 3 images in the one image. And so today we're going to talk about how do we combine these images together in Photoshop and what kinds of software packages are available for us to do this. Okay? So from an artistic sense, really what we're trying to do with a high dynamic range image is we're trying to mimic the way we, with our eyes, see the world. So we see, essentially, because our brains are as powerful as they are, using high dynamic range. And my illustrations work better during the day because it's generally really bright outside, but obviously it's nighttime, so that's a little bit harder. But you'll have to bear with me. If we were to look in the back of the room right now, right, it's very bright. There's a lot of bright lights in there, okay? But we can see everything just fine. Okay, we can see the detail, we can see the plotter in the back and the projector and the little pins on the wall and that sort of thing. Okay? If we really quickly glance from that bright area to outside, right, and we look in the middle of the planter, yeah, it's dark outside, but we can still see detail of the individual leaves of the plants that are outside. Okay? But that's a whole lot darker than what's inside. But our eyes and our brain can really quickly adjust and see things. Okay? As we get older, our eyes don't adjust quite as fast. But the concept is still there. Our eyes and our brain are very, very quick at this. A photograph doesn't adjust. It's just static. And so we try to mimic that through something called tone mapping, which I'll talk about in a second, so that we can actually see a scene, a photographed scene, the same way that our eyes would see a scene. Okay? So we're really trying to mimic how a human eye sees a particular scene. On a more practical side, the other use of a high dynamic range image, those of you that were in 136 before recognize the term HDRI, I'm sure. But a high dynamic range image in its pure sense can be used as a backdrop for a rendering engine, something like V-Ray, for example, where depending on what your camera settings are and your lighting settings within that rendering engine, the background changes based on those settings. So it might get lighter, it might get darker, and the high dynamic range image that we're using is what allows that to happen. Okay, so it does have a use in rendering. If this doesn't make sense to you because you haven't done Rhino and V-Ray yet, that's what 136 is for. Okay? But I at least like to introduce that there is an actual functional reason for these HDRIs, besides just creating pretty pictures. So tone mapping is the process by which we kind of strip down a high dynamic range image into something that we can see and that looks like what we, quote, see in a particular scene with our eyes, right? And the idea is that we're reducing contrast to facilitate a display of things that are in shadows and things that are bright all at the same time, right? It can produce an image that is accurate to the scene, or it can push the boundaries and become a little bit more artistic in its final sense. I'll show you examples of both as we go forward. Okay? So what it is effectively doing is it's looking at various sections of the image. So let's say in this particular image, we'll do a small section right here, and we're looking at shadows and light in this section. And we brighten the shadows so that we can actually see details. And then we move over to a different section of the image, maybe here or maybe here, that's bright. And we again go through and create contrast between the brightness and the shadows in that section of the image. But we're not looking at the image as a whole. So you know how we did those levels adjustments before in last class, you remember? maybe a little bit, right? We were doing it to the image as a whole. Black was black, white was white, and it affected the whole image. Instead, in tone mapping, we're taking small regions of the image and we're adjusting just that small region such that the overall image, we see detail in the shadows and we see detail in the bright areas. So how do we do this, right? Well, of course, our first choice is Photoshop, right? No surprise, because Photoshop's in here. I wouldn't bring this whole thing up and make a big deal of it if we couldn't do it in Photoshop. So we are going to use something called an automated action in Photoshop that will do a large part of this processing for us, right? It's generally going to need a little bit of post-processing. It's not going to be perfect out of the chute, though the more advanced the Photoshop version is, the better the results will be. There have been significant improvements in the newer versions of Photoshop, CS6 and CC. So some of it will be better, though it generally does involve some post-processing, and that works nicely for the fact that we need to kind of learn how to do masks anyway today. There isn't really a built-in high-quality tone mapping solution. So it's not just a button click and you get a perfect result. It involves a little bit of tweaking. Of course, it's available on the lab computers. It can be available on your home computers as well. And that's obviously what we're going to use today. There is another solution that's out there. There's actually a couple more, but really this is the only one that's a competitor to Photoshop. And that is something called PHOTOMATIX. And PHOTOMATIX is really considered to be the highest end of the software that you can use to do tone mapping for high dynamic range images. It's a standalone piece of software, but they do offer plugins that will work on top of Photoshop. So you can, for example, do this within Photoshop. You're working on an image, then you throw it to this plugin, the plugin does its tone mapping, and then you get better results. It is a little bit expensive as a standalone application. You would have to be really into doing high dynamic range images to warrant buying it. But there is a free version, I believe, that you can download and play around with that has a watermark on it, just so you can see what happens. Obviously, it's not available on these lab computers, so you won't get to do that. You'll only be working in Photoshop today, but I at least like to point out that there is an alternative that is kind of common. I would say most of the images that I'll show you in the examples were probably done tone mapping with PHOTOMATIX. That's kind of the most common. If you're searching for HDR images online, chances are they're going to be done with PHOTOMATIX. So let's look at some of the realistic examples and why this might be relevant. Okay, so clearly this is not something that's creating a big dramatic scene or anything, but this is a very, very practical use of a high dynamic range image. So the image up at the top is our original image. If we walked into this building and we were to take a picture, let's say we were real estate brokers, right? And we were going to try to lease this space or sell this space, right? And we were trying to put together a brochure or a website or something to sell this. If we were to go in and take this photo, this would be the standard output. We have very good exposure inside. We have an understanding of what the floor is and what the ceiling is and kind of what the space is like, but we lose all context of what the view is, right? And if we were trying to sell this, this is a high floor, beautiful view, and I don't know what city it's in, but high floor, beautiful view, we want to sell the view in addition to the building. So the high dynamic range image down here lets us see the view out these windows in addition to seeing what's happening inside the space itself. So this becomes a much more powerful tool. The other thing that I will point out is in the high dynamic range, we do get more information in the ceiling. You can see how the ceiling up top is much darker than it is here, which I think is nice. And a little bit more information in the shadows, though it's a dark hardwood floor, so there's not too much to be seen out of it. So a very practical, realistic use. An image like this is a night shot, but the person who shot the photograph wanted to show the color and kind of the general textures that are available in the scene. And so by doing a high dynamic range, we get rich color, but we also see all the individual little lights and points of lights, which is part of the strategy. Okay? Another example here, very much in the realistic realm, and actually this could look like just a standard photograph, right? Not necessarily a high dynamic range. But we have a little bit of extra detail right along the water here in those darkened shadows. We can see just a little bit more out of that photo. So it's subtle, but a little bit of an enhancement. We as architecture people love to photograph buildings at this time of day. It's kind of the twilight time, okay? And the part of the reason that we like this time of day so much is that we can photograph kind of the building, we can see the colors of the building, we can see the dark sky, but we can also see the building with some of the lights on. And we love lights and we love doing lighting, so it's no surprise that we want to see the lighting too. So this time of day is a really good time to try to photograph. The problem is, if we were taking a picture of this scene without high dynamic range, we would get either, right, the lights and everything dark behind it, or we get everything kind of nicely exposed behind it with the colors of the buildings at the bottom, with the lights being too bright, right? So we'd be stuck in kind of the middle of the ground. But by doing high dynamic range, we can take different exposures, we can compile them together, and we get both the nice sunset dusk feel with all the lights that are properly exposed. So it's a really good combination. There are times where people will actually delay the photographs even further apart. Instead of taking 3 in a row, they might delay one with the lights for another hour off of a tripod to be able to add that into the scene later and have a little bit better light quality. Okay? Another example here, projector is always a little bit hard. All of this detail in the shadows here, which I know on the projector you can't see too much of it, that would be completely black if this wasn't a high dynamic range image. So because of the HDR status, we can see a lot more detail in those shadows. Right? This one, maybe it's pushing the boundaries of surrealistic. Maybe the street scene didn't quite look this vibrant, right? Maybe a little bit too much saturation. But I like this image because it points out something else about high dynamic range. So you guys, when I showed you those examples, I told you there were 3 exposures in my example that came together to make the one high dynamic range image. Okay? Well, this is very similar, 3 exposures coming together to make the one image. Okay? The problem is, in a scene like this, there's a lot of moving parts. So you can't say, wait a minute, people, everybody in this scene, stay still. Cars don't move. Right? So what happens is you get things like this. So we can see that we have a license plate of this car shown once for one frame and shown twice for the second frame. Okay? Maybe there was a third frame, but we're not seeing that, so maybe the car stopped or it slowed down enough over the course of those movements. Furthermore, we get kind of a weird splice or piece of a car, right, as that car jumped forward. We get kind of a ghosted man standing there. Right? If we come over here, right, we've got 3 people that are basically standing still, and they show up just fine. Okay? We have another person here that's moving, or he ducks down or something, right? And so we have the nice strong legs, but the body kind of goes away and the head's gone entirely. So the point is, because it's composed of 3 images, if there are things that are moving in the scene, we're going to have to compensate for it or recognize that that can play a role in what the final image looks like. Okay? So it's definitely something to be aware of. Moving back into the architectural example, again, very standard photograph, but part of the reason that it's a really nice photograph is we can see the detail of the textures inside this shadow that we otherwise wouldn't be able to see. So that's what high dynamic range gives us in this context. Right? Similar detail in the shadows. Right? Not as good of an image quality. Okay? An image like this looks even better on my computer than it does on the projector, but in something like this we have obviously the moving water. But because we're creating an exposure where the water's all kind of blurring together, that's okay. Right? We're not trying to freeze the frames of the individual drops, so that works. But we end up with a lot more detail in the shadows and stuff in this kind of sunset scene of the creek or the river. Right? Another example here, similar detail in the shadows. Likewise. Likewise. Right? Another example here, all of these shadows are much lighter than they would be. The bright areas are still exposed. So we can, for example, I know this is a little bit blurry as an image, we can see the paving as it continues both in the shadow and as it continues out into the bright area, okay, which we otherwise wouldn't be able to see. Another example of that kind of nighttime shot, a coastal shot, same kind of general detail. It's in the shadows that we notice the difference. Okay, so part of the problem when I start showing images is like, where do I draw the line of how many images to show? And I like these images, so I just keep showing them, right? So you see lots of things. But these sunsets are what it felt like to be in a particular scene. And that's part of the advantage of of the high dynamic range images. Okay, so then let's move into the more creative side of things. And I'll start with this one, which is reasonably accurate, San Francisco, but there's something about it that makes it a little surrealistic. Right? It has a certain fuzziness or glowing quality to it that makes it just slightly beyond what is normal, though it is a very beautiful picture. Right? So it's just a little bit on the artistic side. Something like this is pushing the boundaries that much more. Right? The sky is probably a little bit darker than it really was. Right? The building itself has a little bit more character than it probably did because they were going after this kind of haunted house, old feel to the particular image. Right? An image like this becomes almost painterly in its quality, so it's exaggerating that much more as part of this. Right? You guys are familiar with the Golden Gate Bridge. This is probably pushing the very boundaries of how much is on the creative side. Right? So the bridge doesn't really look this red. The clouds really don't look that black. Okay? So it becomes a little bit more artistic. And so you have to kind of weigh those options. Right? We're going to talk about panoramas a bit later on. This is a full spherical panorama. So this edge of the photo connects to that edge of the photo if we were to curl it around. Right? Likewise, the bottom here curls around to the bottom, so it would make a perfect sphere. The top curls around to the top. Probably pushing the boundaries of surrealistic, though. Right? Similar here, a little bit too much color saturation, pushing the boundaries a little bit too much. Right? Here, the scene didn't look like this in real life. Right? There's no way. Something like this, a little bit too much mood. But it's a beautiful picture, nonetheless. This one probably is more in the, it could go on the realistic side. A little bit too much color saturation. So let's move from high dynamic range into panoramas and panoramic photography. So what is a panorama? A panorama is essentially a wide-angle view of a particular scene. And in the old days, there was a special type of film called Advantix that Kodak came out with that would allow you to take a, quote, panorama, which was kind of a 4x6 photo that was like 4x9 instead. It was a little bit longer and skinnier. And you could take a, quote, wide-angle view of a particular scene. Now, because we can use software to stitch individual images together, we can create a full 360-degree panorama. We could take a bunch of images such that they wrap all the way around us and behind us, and all the way up above us and all the way below us. Right? Most of our phones have the ability to take panoramas natively. And a lot of cameras are starting to do this now too, where you essentially would take out your phone. How many people have done this, right? And you start and you go along like this, and before you know it, you have a panorama. Okay? Essentially, what your phone is doing is taking a bunch of individual shots and gluing them together. It's just doing it as you take the photo. So panoramas tend to involve lots of images that are stitched together to make an overall sphere. Okay? So in this case, I have kind of the example here of a bunch of individual photos that are then glued together, right, to make that kind of spherical ball around wherever the camera is. Right? So there is some to the mechanics of panoramic photography. And I'm going to actually skip ahead 3 slides because I would rather start with these, and I need to change the order. Right? One of the dangers of stitching images together, and this isn't a full panorama, it's just a group of images that have been stitched together, is we end up with things like this. Right? In this case, we have power lines that kind of end in nowhere. They don't really line up with other parts of the image. Maybe we have images where here's a line on the edge of the pool and it doesn't quite line up. Right? Maybe it's something like this where we're shooting a building. This happens in Street View if you're looking at Google Street View. It happens frequently. It just didn't quite get lined up correctly. And we get buildings that don't quite match. Right? That's a little bit too tall, that kind of thing. All of these problems are called parallax. And so there is a way to correct for parallax, but it has to do with the mechanics of how we shoot the actual panorama. And so by our nature, whether we're shooting with our phones or we're shooting with an individual point-and-shoot camera, Our natural reaction is, I'm going to take a panorama, so I'm going to start here, and I'm going to swing the camera around, and I'm going to take pictures. Now, when we do that, right, let's imagine for a second I took this row of you. Okay? If I stood right at you and I took a picture, right, I'd have all of you in a nice line. Okay? If I suddenly took a picture of you guys kind of like this, right, you wouldn't all appear in that straight line anymore. Okay? You'd appear going off in one direction. If, however, right, I started with my phone and I turned my phone like this and I took a picture, you would stay in line. Okay? So it has to do with the positioning of where the nodal point of the camera is. So cameras work the same as our eyes. When the light comes in past the lenses, right, the image actually flips upside down. Okay, you guys know this maybe from your science classes, maybe, maybe not. Okay, the light that's hitting the back of my eye right now is upside down. But my brain's smart enough to compensate for it, so I recognize all of you as being right side up. Right? There was actually a study done where somebody wore glasses that flipped the image the opposite way, and totally disorienting at first. In 24 hours, the brain corrected it, and everything was right side up again. So anyway, cameras work the same way, in that we have something called the nodal point, where that light that's coming in flips upside down before it hits the sensor. Okay? If we can isolate that point and move the camera around that point, we will no longer have these kinds of errors. Okay? So here's an example. This happens primarily with a near object and a far object. Right? So in this case, you guys in the front, you guys in the back would be the near and the far object. Right? And if I don't rotate the camera around the nodal point, so here I am, right? And I don't exactly know where their graphic is of the nodal point. I'm in front of the nodal point. When I shift and I take a picture of these two, these are no longer in alignment. Right? One's off center from the other. Right? If instead I rotate around the nodal point, you see that the camera went back around wherever the nodal point is. Right? When I move from the first image over here, like that, the second image, these shapes stay in line, and I end up with them just moving in the panorama. So the trick is, if you're shooting one, whether you're shooting by hand, instead of doing this, which is the natural reaction, right, the camera stays steady, and you move around the camera as you shoot. Right? So it's just a simple change in how you do this, and you can get significantly better results. So these are the errors, and I'm going to switch the order. So what are our final results? Right? How do we get outputs? What do they end up being? There's two things. One can be an unrolled image, which I'll show you a lot of today. The truth is that unrolled images are by their nature very distorted. Right? And you have to get used to seeing them that way. And the other is a virtual reality movie that are a lot of times available online. You want to go look at a particular hotel before you go stay there. Chances are they have some of these interactive little panoramas. You click on a particular scene, you drag it around, and you can kind of look interactively. Okay? Those are the two primary outputs of these panoramas. So how do we stitch the images together in the first place? There's a few more options that are available in the realm of panorama stitching. The first is, of course, Photoshop. Photoshop does a fantastic job with about 9 images. It's really, really good. But if you throw too many images at it, or you try to stitch an entire panorama together, a full 360, it doesn't do that great of a job. So it will do it, but it won't be that good. So think of Photoshop in small groups of images. That tends to work best. Right? It is just like the merge to HDR. It's an automated process. It's called Photomerge. So it's really easy, other than you have to let Photoshop do its work. And again, I'll demonstrate this live so you can see it. Right? Mac or PC, all the same stuff that I've talked about before. So there was an absolutely fantastic piece of software called Stitcher that used to do this stitching. And what happened was you would take your images and you'd drop them in, and then you'd kind of drag them in place. And as you dragged them around, it would warp the image, and you could kind of see where it fit, and then you'd hit enter, and it would like glue the image in place. It was really cool, really intuitive way of stitching images together. Did a great job. The company, which was a European company, got bought by Autodesk, who makes AutoCAD and Revit and a lot of the software you're familiar with. And Autodesk decided that they didn't really want to work on it anymore, and the last update that happened was in 2009. So it kind of died, which is really unfortunate. I wish that Autodesk hadn't bought it, because I think it was a really, really great piece of software. That was kind of the first piece of software that I worked on to stitch images together, and I had very, very good results out of it. The one that's kind of taken its place is called PT GUI. It's built on an open source set of software for actually stitching the images together, but it is a graphic interface for it, so you can kind of see what you're doing a little bit better. It's very, very good at stitching images, and it's very fast at doing it, which is definitely an advantage, but of course it costs some money. The good news for you, if this is something that you're interested in, you can actually get a free-to-enter version of software that will let you do everything that I've talked about completely for free. It's open source. It's called Huggin. It's actually available on these lab computers. I used to spend time teaching you guys how to stitch, and it doesn't seem like the interest level has been there in the past, so I've kind of waned off of that and just concentrated on Photoshop a bit. The downside of this is that the actual processing takes time. When you go to process the image, it brings up a little command line thing, and you have to wait for it to scroll and process for a while. So it's not very fast, but like I said, it is free, which is great. Okay? And then there's an app called Photosphere that's available on your iPhone or built into a lot of Android phones. This is Google's piece of software that they're using to kind of enhance their Street View or their Maps app. And what it does is it allows you to do essentially a complete 360 set of images that will stitch together. It is very, very good if you're outside with no objects that are particularly close to you. Right? It does a great job stitching, and it kind of guides you with where to take each photo. If you try to do an interior shot, especially with a low ceiling, it's pretty tough. It just doesn't give the best results. And so you just have to be aware that there are limitations to it. But it is free, and it's really easy to use. So let's look at some examples. Right? Most of the examples that I'll show you are full 360s or at least partial 360s. They're definitely 360 in the horizontal, but they may or may not be in the vertical. This is that site in Peru that I talked about before. Couldn't resist taking some panoramas there. But I like this image. This was not the final image. It's not the corrected image. But I like this one because you can see this line that appears on both sides. That was one photograph that I took that I didn't have correct exposure on. I did expose the scene in the wrong way when I shot the image, and as a result, that image stands out in contrast to the rest of the images. When you go to stitch your images together today, whether you choose the sample files or you choose your own images, you'll find that if the exposures are different, it's kind of obvious. And so it's nice to have those exposures consistent. Certainly I could fix this in Photoshop. I could do a little clone stamping over it, and it would go away. Another example here from up higher in the complex, up on top of one of the walls, and you can kind of get a sense. The scalloped edges are a sign that it's not a full 360. Right? So this was a series of single images. These lines represent one image. Right? It's just been warped and stretched to fit the bottom of this. Right? Another example here, this one had been cropped, but you get the same idea of the very large, wide scene. So when you're photographing, it doesn't even matter what I was photographing at this particular point. The point is I forgot to shoot a particular image, and when you forget, you end up with a hole. Right? So in this case, I have the black hole where I forgot to take a couple of images. Now, I could certainly go back in after the fact and Photoshop that in and make it go away. But I like to show that missing an image is not necessarily a good thing. So you want to count carefully. So the other thing about panoramas is that things that are straight, when they're put into a panorama and they're unrolled, become curved. So if we go back a couple slides to like these walls, right? These are straight in real life, but in the panorama they appear curved, right? That appears curved, that appears curved. So, going forward, if we took a panorama and we ended up with an image like this with a bunch of straight lines, right? What does this look like in real life? Right? It's a circle. It's actually taken right from the center of the circles at Mirai. It's taken from right there. Right? So it's important to distinguish that when you look at a panorama, you're not seeing what you're used to seeing. Right? So you have to kind of shift your brain to understand that these represent curving circles, not straight lines. This is actually one of the sample sets of images that I'll give you to work with today if you want to play around with it. This is in Ollantaytambo in Peru. this scene, I'll show you another scene, looks straight across, and I have the next panorama is right from through that door on the other side. So there's a relationship between these two. This one's a very, very good set of images. There's very little parallax, if any, in this set. They were really well aligned when I shot them. Even the grass lines up very, very nicely. Right? So here we are on the opposite side. This one, the stitch didn't quite work out. The horizon line isn't set right, so it's a little wonky. But we're looking straight across. That was where that last one was shot. We also made a mistake here. There's an extra set of shoes that shouldn't have been there. So that's something that we could fix in Photoshop, but it's important to see that those kinds of things do happen. So just like with the high dynamic range image, when you're stitching together a bunch of individual images, you end up with images that overlap, but things that move in a particular scene get shown, right, multiple times or over and over again. And so you can get these kind of ghosted images of people walking through a space because there's so many images that are layered up next to each other. It can be a really nice effect, certainly, but it's important to recognize that that does happen. Right? So here's an example of Worcester Hall, the architecture building at Berkeley, and I chose to include this one because you could see that I didn't expose the scene correctly, and certainly it would be very fixable in the sky, but this line here that goes across the building is not fixable, right? Or it would be very difficult. Certainly, yes, I could actually fix it using some creative masking, but it would be a lot harder. So it's important to recognize you really want to lock those exposures in before you take a photo like this, right? Same exact view, but at night, right? One of my favorite views because all the tower lights in Worcester are on. They're always on, right? So, like I said, lots of images put together give you the opportunity to have ghosted images or multiple versions of the same people in the image. So this was a good friend of mine and myself. We decided that we were going to do a panorama and play around with it such that every picture we shot, we had ourselves in it. So we end up with 12 copies of each other in the scene looking at each other and whatever. So you can get creative about how it goes together. The subject matter of this, it was a computer lab. It didn't really matter. It was just the fun of the fact that you could end up with yourself in it over and over again. Another example here, this is in the Chabot Space Center. We were laser scanning a Soyuz Soviet capsule. But here's a perfect thing. When I was shooting the picture, I didn't notice that somebody stood in front of the camera, right? And so it was only the lower half of the images where she stood in front of the camera. So I end up with half of her before the upper half goes away. So it kind of destroys the look of the image, but it's at least important to recognize that does happen. And you want to be aware of what's happening, what's moving in a particular scene to get better results. Right? This was a handheld set of panoramic images that were shot on the Brooklyn Bridge. I didn't have my tripod with me. I could have shot myself for not bringing my tripod, but I would have really liked to have it, but I didn't. But because I was very careful about my body position when I was shooting, such that I moved myself around the camera rather than moving the camera around me, I was able to create a panoramic image shot by hand that didn't have a bunch of the parallax. Right? I have a lot of images of long parallel stretches that could have resulted in parallax when I went to stitch. You know, this example, the individual little lines here are part of the bridge, and when they stitch together, I don't have that because I was careful with how I shot it. This is in Alameda. This was a quick one shot around. The scalloped edges are a sign that it hasn't been cropped at all, and it was just each of those little loops is an individual image. I think there's 12 total images that were stitched together. Right? Another example on the beach. Right? Right? This one's a full 360, so the top touches and the sides touch. It's important to note the distortions that start to happen. So here in the middle of the scene, we're seeing the tree is straight, but when you get up to the top, the tree kind of bends over. That's because of the stretching and distortion. If you think about you have an orange and you try to unpeel or peel the orange, right? It's really hard to get the peel off in one continuous sheet, right? It automatically kind of splits when you tear into it because that circular object can't be flattened out. If you think about a map, we have the same problems. And what happens is we end up distorting the tops. We end up stretching the tops of these images. Another example here with the scalloped edges, right? A full 360 here. Lots of little sun bursts off of the lens certainly something to be aware of. I think this is a set that I have that you can work with today. Kind of a more creative look at something. It could be more artistic when you stitch it together. I'll end with about 6 or 7 or 8 of these images that came with my thesis. I got really interested in panoramic photography as an undergrad, and as a result, kind of used this as my whole thesis argument in grad school, centered my whole paper around panoramas. So I took tons and tons of panoramas, way more than I showed you here. And I ended up working on the airport because it was such a generic space. But anyway, you can see that there's just lots and lots of panoramas at the airport. Diagrams. I ended up having to construct line drawing panoramas as part of my thesis. So this was part of the construction. If you guys have done constructed panoramas, 2 points or 3 points, constructed perspectives, 2 points or 3 points, it's essentially the same thing except you're passing through a curving object to get the curve. It's kind of interesting. It was a fun exercise to try to do. This was a piece of the final drawings where you have the spherical panorama and then you have the other sphericals that were projected on the walls, so you get this layering of spherical panoramas. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll take about, looks like a 9-minute break. We'll start back up at 7, and I'll go through what we're doing in exercise 106, the various processing techniques, and then also a lot about how we're going to do masking and kind of get you an introduction to masking. Okay, so we're going to start back up with the demonstrations for exercise 106. I asked you when we went out on exercise 103 to try to shoot a set of bracketed images and to try to shoot a panoramic set of images. Now, you may or may not have been successful with your endeavor to do that. If you were not successful, it's not a problem. If you go to today's exercise 106 and you scroll down to the very bottom, there's a bunch of downloads. There's zip files of high dynamic range images. These are the same ones that I'll do live in lecture. Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3. And there's also a set, 3 sets of panoramic images. You're welcome to play around with any of those groups of images. They're there as samples. And not surprisingly, as a result, you don't need to comment on today's exercise because they're all kind of going to end up being the same. Anyway. Okay, so let's start in on the world of Photoshop. Now, usually I go to File and then I open a particular file. Since I'm not using a traditional method here, I'm using an automated process. Instead of going to File and then Open, I'm going to come down a little bit further and look for something called Automate. And what an automatic process is it's a script that Photoshop is designed to run that makes our life easier. And so when I go to the first one, which is Merge to HDR Pro, right, that brings up this little dialog box. This is essentially going to combine the 3 images for us. And the nice thing is that it does stuff like aligning the images without me having to manually align the images, which is great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this little Browse button. And when I do that, I'll go to my folder for today. And I'm going to load up the first 3. Now, I'll end up doing this several times so that you can see it. You know that I like to repeat things, so I'll make sure that I do that. So I have 3 images of the sunset. These are the 3 that I showed you earlier. And I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift and select all 3. So I have 1, 2, and 3. And I'll say OK. And once I have those 3 images together, the checkbox at the bottom here, which is on by default, says attempt to automatically align the source images. I want Photoshop to do that. It saves me from having to do it. So we'll go ahead and check the box, and I'll say OK. And we'll see that Photoshop will do some stuff. Right? There's a bunch of layer stuff going on here and whatever. We'll let it do it. Okay? And I end up with a resulting image. And so we can see down here at the bottom that this image here is made of 3 images. Okay? The middle one is an exposure value of 0.00. Sorry, it's behind my head. And I have one that's minus 1.85 and one that's plus 1.74. That was what my camera created when I did this. And when I composite the 3 images together, this is the resulting image, which is pretty good. Right? Photoshop did a pretty decent job. I do, however, have some presets for the tone mapping that are available up here. Default is obviously what it showed up as the default. But depending on which one of these options I pick, I'm going to get different results. So for example, if I picked City Twilight, right, notice that this is not a city at twilight by any means. Right? The resulting image really doesn't look that great. Okay? But if I come down here to maybe photorealistic, right, I might have a pretty good image. Okay? I can choose some of the other options here. I could say photorealistic high contrast. I can do photorealistic low contrast. And you can see that there's subtle differences between those. Right? Likewise, I could go into surrealistic, for example, and maybe that's pushing the boundaries a little bit far. Okay? But the point is that it's worth playing around with these presets and that there isn't a scripted answer for your particular set of images that you bring in. You may find that one works better than the other. What these presets are really doing is they're adjusting a bunch of the sliders that show up down here at the bottom. And so we could manually go in and adjust those sliders as well. So for example, if I didn't want quite so much saturation, right, I could adjust the slider down and get less saturation. I could adjust it way down and get very little saturation, almost a black and white image, right? Or I could adjust it way up and get too much. So I have a lot of flexibility in what I can do, right? Likewise, I can adjust the vibrance, right, up or down, and you can see that that gives me more or less color, right, in a slightly different way than saturation does. Highlights control the lighter areas of the scene, right? So I can make the lighter areas lighter, or I can make them darker. Right? Likewise with shadow, I can control just the shadow portions of the scene. So just with these sliders, I have a pretty good way of dialing in what I want the image to look like. Okay? Much easier than it used to be. I'm going to go back up here to my photorealistic because I like the outputs, and then it looks pretty decent. Right? Hidden under here, there is also a curve, so I could do curve adjustments if I wanted to. I'm not encouraging that because I think it's easier to use the sliders. So we have those established. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and click OK. And we'll do a little bit more post-processing here, and I'll end up with my final resulting image. There it is. Okay? So let's do this process again with a second set of images. You're only going to do it with one set of images today, but I'm going to go do it again just for the practice of it. I'll go to File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. And this time I'll pick a different set of images. These three images are from the top of Half Dome. So we'll go ahead and select those three. And I'll say OK. There they are. I want to make sure that it automatically aligns the images. Checked. Say OK. And through some Photoshop magic, it brings those together. Now in this particular set, I have an exposure value of 0.00. But then I have minus 1.99 and plus 2.01. That was what my camera did in its native bracketing. So in this scene, right, I can again go through my presets. I could try photorealistic, right? I could try City Twilight. No, that's not very good. I could do photorealistic low contrast, maybe. Saturated, maybe. So you can play around with what set of images really looks right. And then you can also adjust these sliders to find out what looks right to your eye. Okay, so let's go with that. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And it will then composite my images together, giving me the final image there. Okay, which again looked a lot better than the first image that you saw. Right, so it's definitely an improvement. So that is the Merge to HDR option. Now I'm going to do the exercise today slightly out of order because I want to demonstrate the two automated processes side by side. And then I'll come back and talk about the masking portion. So I'm going to move to the next, which is stitching the panorama together. And I'll go to, again, File, Automate. But this time, instead of picking the Merge to HDR Pro, I'm going to pick the next option down, which is Photomerge. Right? And Photomerge brings up a slightly different dialog box. Right? Generally, under Layout, we're going to leave it set to Auto. If you knew how you took the pictures, you could specify. But Auto does a pretty good job of kind of correcting for distortions. Once again, I'll click Browse, and I'll pick my images. I'll do that in just a second. But down below, I have the ability to check the box for Blend Images Together, which I do want to have happen. Now, if I shot my images and they had darker borders on them, which is called vignetting, it has to do with the lenses, I might check this for vignette removal. The images that I downloaded or that I gave you as samples, if you choose to use those, don't need vignette removal checked. And geometric distortion correction, the scenes that I've given you really don't have a lot of geometry in them. They're mostly outdoor scenes. So, or in the case of the ET courtyard, the geometry is pretty far away, so I don't think you really have to worry about it too much. So I'll leave those unchecked. And then I'll go up to Browse. And so instead of the High Dynamic Range folder, I'm going to go into the Panoramas, and I'll pick a sample set of images. And when I do this, I'm not going to pick all the images. Right? I think there's 40-something images. This would be useful if you were doing hug-in, where you're trying to stitch everything together. But instead, I really only want to stitch a kind of a small group of images, maybe 9, 12 images, something like that. So I'm going to take the first 3 images here. So I'll take 1, 2, and 3. Right? And then I'll look for where I switch to be a little bit higher. And maybe I'll take those 1, 2, 3. Maybe I'll take 4 there. All right, we'll come down here a little bit more. And I'll take like this one, this one, this one, and that one. Something like that. We're throwing some various images at Photoshop to see what Photoshop does. Okay? So let's say, no, I didn't really want that one. Hold on. Yeah, why not? We'll throw that one at it. Maybe those two. And so I'll go ahead and say OK. So again, I picked a smaller group of images. If you do all the images, you'll end up with it not combining together correctly. And you'll see that. You're welcome to try it. But it does kind of happen. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And this process takes a lot longer than the Photomerge or the merge to HDR. And you can see that it's bringing in all of the individual photos, and then it's going to go through and attempt to align the images based on what's in the images, right? And this may or may not be problematic. This image here that I threw in at the end might not have a good alignment point, in which case we'll be in trouble. So we'll see. And this is an exercise in patience. The good news is you don't actually have to do anything, right? All right, so it really didn't do a very good job. Right? So let's try that one again. Sometimes we get this where they just didn't really work together. So let me try a different one. No, we don't want that. Try it again. File, Automate, Photomerge. And let me try instead, let me try a different set. I know this set worked this morning, so I'll do it with these. All right, so we'll try this again. And again, it'll load in the images for us. And now it's blending the layers together for me. All right. So it did a pretty good job there. So we actually got a good blend of the images. Okay. So if I look at this in its combined glory here, right? It was able to stitch the upper 4 images. It was able to stitch these middle 4, and I looked like I picked maybe the wrong ones, and it picked these bottom 4 that are kind of going off in the other direction, but they seam together very nicely. Okay? So you might be able to see a little bit of ghosting. You see those little white lines? Maybe on the projector you can see that. If you get those when you do an export, those will go away. It's just a slight artifact in Photoshop showing you. But this brings out a really good opportunity to talk about what Photoshop did in this process. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off all the layers for a second here. And I'm going to turn on just a single, let me turn on just this layer. Okay? And I'm going to disable the layer mask. All right. Come on. There we go. Like that. So this is the original image. And Photoshop warped it a bit. You can see that it has a curved top and a curved bottom and slightly curved sides. It warped it a little bit so that it would line up nicely with the image next to it. Once again, let me disable the mask here. Right? And so I have these two images that are going together. Okay? But if I look closely at these images, right, I have some problems. Right? See how the edge of this lake doesn't really line up correctly? Okay? So what Photoshop does is it tries to combine these two images together in a way that gets rid of these weird seams. And so what it does is it creates what are called layer masks that control what part of each of these layers is actually seen. So yes, I have these two images, but when Photoshop assigns the layer masks to them, right, it essentially controls what parts of the images are shown. Okay? So this original image, right, now is kind of clipped off right there. Right? Likewise, it's clipped off over here. And when I turn on the next one, it seams together with this image. Okay? So Photoshop has actually combined the images together such that I don't have a seam that I can see anymore. Right? So it's done a really good job during that stitching process, essentially getting rid of the edges of that particular photo. So if I were to turn the rest of these on, you can see that they all kind of come together with those same kinds of little stitch marks. Right? And so let me do Control 0, and we can kind of zoom out, and we can see that on any one of these images, there's only a portion of the image that's actually being used as part of the final image. Okay? And Photoshop did that for us. But this concept of masking works regardless of what we're doing. So anything in the mask that's black is transparent, and anything that's white is shown. Okay? So if we come back to, say, this image, okay, I can use the same principle to make some modifications to this image. So let's say, for example, that I felt like these shadows were too light. Okay? Maybe I'd come up to Layer, and I'd do an adjustment layer with curves. Okay? And I'd play around with these, and I'd say, okay, you know what? That looks much better in the shadows in here. Right? Maybe it looks better to you, maybe it doesn't. Right? But let's, for argument's sake, let's say that it does. But in the process, I've kind of messed up what the sky looks like, and I've messed up what it looks like down here. Right? It's much too bright down here. So when I created that adjustment layer, it looks an awful lot like the layers over here, where I had a layer and then I had a mask. Okay? In the case of this, I have an adjustment and I have a mask that's been assigned to it. The mask right now is all white. Okay? But if I were to paint black on this mask, I could control what parts of the image have the adjustment applied and what parts don't. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the left side here, and I'm going to pick the brush tool, right, which is right here. And when I pick the brush tool, as before, I have abilities to change the size and also the hardness of the brush. We'll leave it at its current settings for right now. But I'm going to look at my two colors. I have black and I have white. So if I were to paint, the color on top, by the way, is the color you're going to paint with. If I were to paint in white on this scene, because the mask is already white, nothing would happen. So I can paint away and nothing's going to happen. If, however, I were to change my colors and make it black, and I'm going to use this little double-sided arrow as a way of switching from black to white. When I switch to black as my foreground color, and I paint on the mask, so I know I'm painting on the mask because the mask or the layer itself is highlighted in blue, and the mask has these little brackets around it. Right? When those are around it, I know I'm painting on the mask. And if I were to paint in black, right, whatever I paint will not have the adjustment applied to it anymore. Right? So here it is on and off. So you can see that it's no longer applied to the sky. So I'll go ahead and I'll paint off the sky. And you see that my mask, which used to be 100% white, now has a black top. All right, so let me go ahead and paint this in a little bit more. Right, maybe something like that. Okay, and then I could go ahead and I could paint in the bottom here. Oops, too much. Let me go back and paint with white again, like that. Okay, so now my mask, which used to be white, has a black top and a black bottom. So if I were to turn it on and turn it off, you can see that it's essentially changing just this part of the scene. Right? Looks like I missed the little patch up there, so let me go ahead and get rid of that. Right? So there it is, controlling just that part of the scene. Maybe let's try something different to illustrate this. Okay? So I'll go ahead and I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. This time I'll do a Channel Mixer. And this might not be the best thing to elect to do, but it will certainly showcase what I'm talking about. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this image into black and white. Right? And maybe I'll play around with my various filters and I'll get a nice high contrast black and white image. Something like that. Okay? So the way it is right now, I have my black and white filter and it's applying to the whole image. Okay? But let's say that I wanted part of this image to not be in black and white but to be in color. Okay? I can choose what part of the image has this adjustment applied and what doesn't by changing the mask. So once again, I'll click on the white rectangle here, selecting the mask, and then I will paint with my brush with the black, the part of the image that I want to have in color. Right? So let's say that in this case I want to have the center section here in color. I would just start painting, and lo and behold, that section turns back into being in color. Okay? And it certainly should be a little bit easier to see that that particular section is coming back into color now. Okay? So I have that flexibility to kind of control and to use certain parts of this image, right, with this color. Let's flip over into the sunset. Maybe this is a better example, and I'll do this in black and white. So let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer. Once again, I'll go to Monochrome. Let me see what I can come up with here. Ooh, that's ugly. Yeah, whatever. We'll do that one. And I'll work on my mask, again with the brush tool, and I'll paint with black such that maybe the sky becomes colored again, but the water stays black and white. Right? The nice thing about working with masks is that sometimes you make a mistake. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Right? Because you're working in a mask, and you can see there's my mistake, I can just go back, switch my colors to white, and I can paint that right back out, and it goes away. So you're not doing any permanent changes, you're just adjusting the mask. We will spend a lot more time working with masks as we go forward in Photoshop. We're going to isolate objects, get rid of backgrounds, using the masks as a strategy to do that. But it's important to kind of recognize the very beginnings of doing the masks. Right? I could also do, instead of doing an adjustment layer, I could just duplicate the layer and then change the blending mode of the layer. Let's say I went to multiply, for example. Right? And in doing that, maybe that's a little extreme, right? Something like that. I can create a mask that's on this layer, on the blending mode. Okay? In this case, there isn't a mask there yet. So thus far, we've always had that white square. To create a mask from the start, right, I come down here, and at the bottom of my layer palette, there's a rectangle with a circle inside of it. That's the Add New Mask button. And so when I click on Add Layer Mask, you see that it creates the little white square next to my object. And now, again, anything that I paint will no longer have the effect applied to it. Right? So there it is. Okay? So let's say that we're working on a particular scene. We're going to turn this off for a second. And I've worked and I've lightened up that, that section. I want to do another adjustment that works on the rocks in here. Or actually, you know what? Let's say that I wanted to put clouds in the sky because it's a non-cloudy day and I want to add some clouds. So I could go online and we'll do a Creative Commons search and we'll do a cloudy sky. And I want one kind of a similar, distance, similar look. Right? For the fun of it, let's pick this, right, with these puffy clouds. Let me go ahead and view the image, and I'm going to save the image to my flash drive here. Let's see. Let's go back here. This will be 106. Oops. HDR. And we'll go ahead and click save. Okay, so I have those nice clouds. Let's go back into Photoshop and let's say I wanted to put those into this scene. I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll bring in those clouds. There they are. I need to make this a little bit bigger, so I'll hold down Shift while I do this. Maybe like that. Sometimes when you're doing this, it's helpful to adjust the opacity so you can kind of see the two images and line them up. I'm looking